All right, it's six o'clock. So welcome to the Gender Sound Sessions at ESMUC. Today on our second session, we are very proud to present Professor Sherrie Tucker from the University of Kansas and present her talk. Maybe more than a talk, it's going to be a masterclass. listening to the changes, historical perspectives on jazz, race, and gender justice. Dr. Tucker, she's professor in American Studies at the University of Kansas and the author of Dance Floor Democracy, The Social Geography of Memory at the Hollywood Canteen, Swing Shift, All-Girl Bands from the 1940s, and she's a co-editor of Big Ears, Listening for Gender in Jazz Studies with Nichole, Rustin, a book containing a variety of important approaches towards research in gender and jazz studies that has very much influenced our gender sound seminars. Dr. Tucker, she's currently serving on the editorial collective of the book Improvising Across Abilities, Pauline, Oliveros, and the Adaptive Use Musical Instrument. She's also co-editor of American Studies with Randal, Jelks, and she's a series editor of music culture at Wesleyan University Press with Deborah, Wong, and Jeremy Wallach. On today's session, Dr. Tucker, she will share her current thinking on how feminist jazz historians would look at jazz without patriarchy, how to dismantle the systems of oppression, what methods, archive, approaches, potential case studies could help us to listen to these changes and bring social and cultural transformation with the creation of new jazz cultures, practices, and music. It is a privilege to have you here, Dr. Tucker, today. Thank you all the participants too, and we remind you that afterwards will be questions and answers for everybody. Welcome, Sherrie.
Thank you so much. It's really, well, I want to thank ESMUC for the amazing Gender and Sound seminar series, and especially to Angels. And I wanted to say before I start, what a privilege it is for me to be included on this program. I'm thrilled to be here. So today let me get my, I think this is correct. Is this my screen? Let's give it a try. We were there a minute ago. That looks like my screen. Okay. So today I'm going to share with you some work that's really in progress, and I'm slow, so it's work that you may have heard before that is still in progress, and I thank you for your patience as I continue to work out some questions that are important to me and I think are pertinent not only for researching gender and jazz studies, but any gender and popular music or music studies. So I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes and then or less. And then I'd love to hear your questions, your answers, your ideas, your thoughts on how to listen to the changes in the jazz past or in the music past in the areas of your interests, guided by the principles that I'm going to be working with today from the Institute of Jazz and Gender Justice. So by changes, it's kind of a pun. And for those of you familiar with jazz, we talk about, or maybe, in other musics that use a lead sheet, we talk about playing the changes, how you navigate the chord changes when you're playing. And a lot of times, I and others have also used that as a metaphor for thinking about how performers and listeners play the changes of the parameters of our social systems, our societies. So this paper is called Listening to the Changes, Historical Perspectives on Jazz, Race, and Gender Justice. For much of my career, I have worked in a field that I would call feminist jazz studies, with a focus on women jazz instrumentalists. I have scoured the archives for traces of both the living and the dead, and I've interviewed people, but these activities alone do not make my work feminist. I consider the feminist part to be an analytic of power and I want to do more than just fill the gaps. I don't want to just add the women. I want to do justice. Okay, this is intersectional work, and not just in terms of checking off the boxes, gender, race, class, sexuality, etc., and being complete, because it's never complete. And once I think it's complete, I'm sunk in terms of so doing justice. And I know that if I'm not attentive, the reason that it's intersectional is because if I'm not attentive to the intersections of race, ethnicity, class, sexuality, nation, empire, capitalism, politics, religion, on and on and on, as well as gender, I risk leaving out the least powerful and most marginalized people, and also the most critical analytics of power. It's possible to do feminist jazz studies without focusing on women instrumentalists, and it's also possible to focus on women jazz musicians without doing feminist jazz studies. So I want to do both. But I often feel that while I think I'm doing justice, what I'm really doing is inclusion, and the analytic of power falls out. So for the past 5 years, I have been following the ground-shifting work of Terry Lynn Carrington and Asia Burrell Wood at the Institute of Jazz and Gender Justice at Berklee College of Music, not only because I hope for a different future, but because I believe that what they're doing there in that institute offers a new model for producing meaningful studies of the jazz past. When asked about the title of the institute, Jazz and Gender Justice, by my brilliant former, my co-editor of Big Ears, Nichole T. Rustin Paschal at the Feminist Theory and Music Conference of 2019, Terry Lynn Carrington, she asked, I don't know if I lost the beginning of the sentence in there somewhere, so I'm going to repeat it. Nichole Rustin asked Terry Lynn Carrington why she was using the term gender justice as opposed to, say, something like gender equity. And Terry Lynn Carrington said that she got that language from Angela Davis, a member of the board of the Institute of Jazz and Gender Justice, which is an illustrious Black feminist advisory board. And Angela Davis explained that a framing like jazz and gender equity would not get at the conditions that produced the inequity. So inclusion isn't enough. Justice would get at the root. So she named it Jazz and Gender Justice. This inspires me. I know that gender equity is not what I want in the feminist jazz archive or a feminist jazz narrative strategy. I don't want equal linear feet of archival materials or musician names in the index. At least I don't just want that. I want the archives and narratives that get at the conditions that produce the differences in who speaks and who is heard. And so I want to repurpose the weight of those missing linear footprints that I always notice when I go into an archive, and the missing names. And I want that work to challenge our ideas of what jazz sounds like and affects the ways that we listen. If adding in women and gender to the existing archive or narrative does not get at the conditions that produce the inequity, then how does one go about pursuing jazz and gender justice as a feminist jazz scholar who researches women musicians of the past? The Institute's question, what would jazz sound like in a culture without patriarchy, which is all over the website. It's twice, in fact, on this one page of the website. That is a very different kind of question than the questions that I had been accustomed to using. Those questions that I typically was using were things like, where are the women? Looking at a history, instead of presuming that women are absent because they weren't there, I say, where are the women? It's a good feminist historiography question, right? Or how does gender shape jazz discourse? So even looking at a masculinist narrative, I could say, how does gender shape this? as a future-directed orientation geared toward creating new jazz cultures, practices, and music that dismantle systems of oppression and yield new sets of changes with transformative social and cultural ripple effects, the framework of jazz and gender justice is most actively sounding changes in contemporary jazz music making, education, listening, and study, but it's also sounding changes in feminist jazz studies. I'm not the only one who's being invigorated by this. In her new work on jazz education, Tracy McMullen has been studying the Institute of Jazz and Gender Justice as, quote, rooted in a long lineage of African-American practices and traditions that put collaboration, care, and justice at the center, at the heart of jazz. What is new with the Institute, argues McMullen, is, quote, the positioning of this value system within an influential post-secondary jazz program. In her exciting forthcoming article in Jazz Culture, Nichole T. Rustin Paschal draws on the Institute in positing a jazz feminist theory. Jazz feminist, I have in quotes because it is Nichole's term. She's interested in a jazz feminist theory, praxis, and vantage point as a particular formation of Black feminisms and distinct from feminist jazz studies. And she draws from this institute as part of the model that she's developing. So if you haven't taken a look at this website, I would say that even if jazz is not what you are interested in and not what you study, it's worth taking a look at. At the Institute for Jazz and Gender Justice, jazz without patriarchy isn't just jazz with women in it. It is jazz that welcomes people, quote, of all gender and sexual identities to achieve the goal of true gender diversity in the field, unquote. And because patriarchy is about power, the answer to what would jazz without patriarchy sound like is not exactly the same, only with all genders doing it. There's a hope, there's a belief that that the music would be different in that kind of in a culture without patriarchy. So it must be responsive, that this kind of a culture must be responsive to all forms of hierarchy as Black feminist theory and praxis demands. Jazz without patriarchy isn't the same as jazz with diversity. It is jazz without white supremacy, jazz without sexism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, imperialism, war. It's aspirational, it compels, it helps us to imagine different jazz futures, helps us to work toward them. It might get us to something akin to political theorist Social Bickford's model for democratic listening. And she's not a music scholar, she's talking about political listening. And Bickford's model for democratic listening is one in which everyone listens and everyone is heard, where no one has less control than anyone else, and no one is more liable to being distorted to anybody else. I see this in the mission statement. So here's the mission statement of mission, values, and vision. I'm just going to read the first and last sentences of the mission statement because I think they're very interesting. So to begin with, the mission of the Berklee Institute of Jazz and Gender Justice is to recruit, teach, mentor, and advocate for musicians seeking to study jazz with gender justice and racial justice as guiding principles. And they really do that. I mean, I think a lot of music, performance programs sort of see the social justice, an interest in social justice as maybe a good thing, but as an elective, not something that the program would require or integrate into the other requirements. So this is a conservatory performance program, but it also involves readings and rap sessions. I recently was a guest at a rap session at the Institute where talking about social justice is very much integrated into the everything else that is done. And then the last sentence I wanted to say, quote, we seek to engage ourselves and others in the pursuit of jazz without patriarchy and in making a long-lasting cultural shift in jazz and other music communities, recognize the role that jazz can play in the larger struggle for gender and racial justice, unquote. So I want to just observe that this is not a diversity statement. It kind of looks like it's going to be a diversity statement, but it is not the kind of statement that has been studied by Sara Ahmed as non-performative anti-racism, the statement that says we are committed to diversity, so we don't have a problem, and then that's the end of it. Jazz without patriarchy is not the same as that kind of a commitment to take care of a problem. It does not aspire to diversity as variety to prove we don't have a problem, but rather fosters new cohorts of jazz musicians committed to transformative justice and challenges feminist jazz scholars to rethink our methods. So it's proactive, it's reflexive, it compels work. So a moment ago, I cited someone I like very much, Susan Bickford, from her book, and this is this slide is a visual bibliographic reference in case you do not know this book and you're interested. It's a political treatise on dissonance, the dissonance of democracy, listening, conflict, and citizenship, and she writes somewhere in that book, I did not provide a page number, the riskiness of listening comes partly from the possibility that what we hear will require change from us. So listening is not passive. So what does this paradigm shift demand of me as a feminist jazz studies scholar of the jazz past? I am more accustomed to asking others to change how they listen to jazz history. How does listening to the guiding principles of jazz and gender justice require change from me? What kind of change? Mind you, after 30 years of writing about women in jazz while resisting the thankless paradigm of women in jazz that's always counting women out of jazz, even as it purports to count them in, I'm ready for change. So I'm heeding that call in the moment. And in case I said that that went by too quickly, I just want to say, sometimes I say things quickly because I feel like I've said it's something I've been grappling with so long that a shorthand will suffice. But I'll just say that the problem, Norma Coates writes about this in her work on rock, and I've really taken this to heart, is that writing about women, she says that writing about women in rock always necessitates taking women out of rock first and then adding them in. So if you say women in rock, you're sort of conceding to rock not having women. Same thing with jazz. If you do, and I have never tried to be a women in jazz scholar, but by writing about women in a field where they're thought not to exist, I'm always in that position of adding women in, while at the same time saying, no, jazz already has women in it. So it's a conundrum that I'm very tired of, and I'm thrilled with this new paradigm, and I think it's going to open up other possibilities. So what are those other possibilities? First I made a slide of talking points, and then I thought, no, they should be listening points. So these are my listening points. These are what I'm thinking about as ways to do the kind of work I do, but do differently and more responsively to jazz and gender justice. So I'm going to listen to the changes, social, musical. I'm going to listen to the changes that affect musicians and their communities. So I'm not just listening, creating a social context for the music I'm studying, or looking at music as kind of the thing that's going on at the same time as the historical timeline, but I'm thinking about how Terry Lynn Carrington talks about jazz without patriarchy as this is a great quote. Actually, I think about how to set it up. She said this in a panel. Someone asked her about to say more about jazz without patriarchy, and she said that she said, quote, different information would have been coming to the music if the experiences of the people making it had been balanced. So this is for me a new way of connecting. It's a future-oriented way of connecting social change and musical change. It's that the music would have been different. We don't know what it would sound like because it hasn't happened yet, or it's happened in spurts and moments and place. But historically, I'm not going to be able to go back in history and find that connection, but it's a question I can ask of the history. Is I can study the changes that would have set people out of balance, and I can listen to how historical narratives tip the balance one way or the other. The second point there would be listening to the listeners. Who is listeners? Who is listening? It would be imagining that everyone has a listening history and everyone is sounding and listening in the moment that you are studying them. Listen to them as people who have hopes for the future, and they don't know what's going to happen next. So it's a kind of it's a different approach to history for me because I'm looking to the past, but I'm not looking backwards. I'm still looking forwards, and I'm looking at people in the past as people who are looking forward and listening forward. They don't know what's going to happen next. So listening for everyone talking and listening at once, not just for the solos. I'm taking that directly from Elsa Barkley Brown. I've been using that for a long time, but I'm still, as have others, but I'm thinking about it slightly differently with this forward motion, and it makes me think of different connections I haven't considered before. And then finally, listen again. You know how some albums, and I know that dates me to say the word albums, but there we go. Some albums are different every time you listen to them. So some studies are like that too. So in 2002, so this is like a way long time ago, 20 years ago, I was contracted by the National Park Service to do a research study on New Orleans jazz women. I wrote this really, really long report, and it's online. It's available online as a PDF. But the main thing that I learned from putting it together was how little that I knew about race and gender in the days of very, very early jazz. So, and in New Orleans. So I keep returning to it. It haunts me. It's something I listen to over and over again, and I always hear something new. So I turn to it with these questions that I have about jazz and gender justice. So when I started my research on New Orleans jazz women, I began, as I often do, by asking, what's the dominant story? What's the typical narrative about early New Orleans jazz that I know? And that changed really fast. So I would like to maybe back it up if I can figure out how to do that. Okay, yeah, so there we go. So there's the typical story, and these are actually the exact images that are used in Ken Burns' jazz when he talks about early New Orleans jazz. So we have Jelly Roll Morton on the left, and then we have an unnamed sex worker on the right. And this is presented as a nostalgic story. It's presented as quaint and colorful. And I keep, so I turned to that when I first started my research for the New Orleans Jazz National Park. And I tried to, I asked questions of it, because I often find that usually a masculinist story is not devoid of gender. It's not devoid of women even. It's but looking at how the story is shaped. So I then, think of the unnamed sex worker. I don't know who she is. I'm sorry. I don't. I wish I knew her name. I don't. But I'm going to continue talking about her as both a figure that is used to represent sort of the background, the context for jazz history, and Jelly Roll Morton. And I'm also going to think of her as a listener. So she's an early jazz listener. The other place that, and then I look for contradictions. I look for, where do women show up as musicians, for example? And the place that I found doing my research was pretty easy to find, was the place where women showed up on the right, were women pianists who played in the New Orleans jazz revivals in places like Preservation Hall. So women pianists who, interestingly enough, are the same generation as Jelly Roll Morton, but who don't show up in that early history. They show up as older women reviving an old music. So I named these stories. I looked, I name the dominant discourse when I locate them. So I talk about the brothel fantasy, and then I talk about the tradition bearers fantasy, and I compare them and think about them. So one woman whose name I don't know is associated with the birth of jazz. She's there, she hears it, she's listening. One woman whose name I learned when I saw her play when I was a tourist in the 80s. I saw her play with the Preservation Hall Band many decades after she became one of the first piano players in a jazz band. Some would say that Emma Barrett, who's on the right there, played jazz as early as 1910. But either way, we don't know very much about either of these women through this pair of stories.